So I see Dr. Seasholes is here, which is wonderful. And we are up to 81. So we are rolling. It is a sea of black squares today. Everybody is definitely tired. Nobody wants to expose themselves this morning. Goodness gracious. Well, you don't have to, but it's oh, here we go. At the very least, the mug holders should be. Do you want to see Duncan? I always want to see Duncan. Are you at the Duncan at Spring Streets by Catholic Memorial in West Roxbury? Oh, it's the Duncan in what's it called, Schiffman or whatever there. Who are my mug drinkers? Do we have mug drinkers? Show me your mugs. Ellie, I mean, that's a nicely patriotic mug and everything, but it's not. You still have to earn your mug. There should be oh, there's Emma has hers. That makes me so happy. Alexander has his Norwegian mug.
Mug drinker sounds like an epic insult.
Pardon?
Mug drinker sounds like an epic insult.
You're not drinking the physical mug, you're drinking out of it. And I'm looking for, and now he's got his coffee. What about Hickory and who else has mugs? Forest, right? All right, anyway. Who was the first one? Who was the first one who had the mug? Who got the first mug who was holding out on me? I'm having a mental blank. Anyway. Ellie, do you raise your hand? Is that true? Mug here. Okay. So last week, I have to tell you, the question was way too easy because too many of you got it, right? The question was, and the problem was that he said it in the actual lecture. So, and it was such a memorable story. So you guys were all able to remember it. But what was the town where the tar and feathering used the beating a man with a live goose?
Salem.
Very good. So Chrissy Benson, Daniel Lee, Jack Price, Eric Beschi, Mikaela Moskowitz, Justin McLennan, Jacob Lau, Hunter Rodriguez, and Windsyr Maughan all got it. It was too easy. This week we were coming to you with a ferociously difficult one. Okay, but this is a beautiful mug. We've got the engraving, the Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre on the front. And I always forget this guy's name. Christopher Sider, Murder of Christopher Sider on the back. Really, really nice mug, two-tone. And as you know, I'm out of children, right? Could you say that it was a Boston Massacre? Isn't that what it's called? Isn't it the Boston Massacre? So as you know, I'm out of children, right? So I have to go on to personal heroes. What else can I do? All right, so let's go through this really fast. Chrissy, 1 to 100.
88.
88. Daniel.
89.
89. Jack.
50.
50. Eric.
21.
21. Mikaela, sorry.
63.
63.
Yeah.
Justin.
34.
34. Jacob.
55.
55. Hunter.
49.
49. Windsyr.
70.
70. So the highest number is Daniel Lee, 89. And the answer, this is Doug Gilmore, the captain of the Leafs in the early 90s to mid 90s. He led the Leafs to the closest they ever came in my lifetime to making it to the Cup. Game 7 of, I guess, 93. Game 7 of the conference finals in 93 from Kingston, Ontario. Well-loved, and number 93. So, Daniel, you are the winner. And I'm dropping that major hint that's what I'm going on from now. Couldn't be Gretzky. Yeah, but I used Gretzky already. So, but that's what I'm going on from now on. This is going to be my go-to. When are you going to choose Matthews? Well, you can use that as your guess. I mean, anything is legitimate, right? It will be players from now on, but you have to guess who it is. They're not all going to be Leafs players. I promise, not all Leafs. I'll mix it up. Daniel, congrats. This is a gorgeous one. All right.
Thank you.
So, and make an arrangement to pick it up at Renaissance Park. So today we are very lucky. We have a beautiful mug. Okay. Try and get the focus on it. There we go. There's the focus. It says building the city. It's a beautiful map that distinguishes the different outlines of periods of building made land, creating made land within the city. And on the back, we have a 19th century view of the common in the public garden, where you can see here. You can sort of see here. What's that? It's water. It's water, right? Because that hadn't been filled in yet. So it's a beautiful mug, and we have joining us. We're very, very lucky. We have really, sort of the foremost expert on explaining how Boston came to look like the way it is today, right? Boston's physical geography has been explained through the works of Dr. Nancy Seasholes for a number of years now. She has her PhD in history and archaeology from BU and works prolifically as an independent historian and archaeologist with beautiful books. I'll do the wave. This is walking tours of Boston's made land, and the readings that you had to do were from two books. This one, Gaining Ground, in its second edition, A History of Landmaking in Boston. And this, my son loves this book, by the way. This is the Atlas of Boston History, which has these big, beautiful color plates on everything you can imagine. My son loves to look through that book. So if you have a younger sibling or cousin or niece or nephew, and you want to give them an educational gift about Boston, I actually highly recommend Dr. Seasholes, the Atlas of Boston History. Or you're a child like me. Yes, Jack, absolutely, me too. I mean, I love maps and I love these color plates. I highly recommend it. And so without further ado, I'm going to give Dr. Seasholes capabilities here. I've made you the co-host, Nancy, and I'm going to let her take it away. You are still on mute though, Nancy. And the coffee is always more delicious out of a commemorative mug.
Okay, there.
Perfect.
So you couldn't hear any of my comments before.
No, I wasn't ignoring you.
Well, actually, it's interesting. I was going to say, hello, everybody. And I'm sorry not to see you in person, but actually, I couldn't be there if this were an in-person thing. My partner is in the highest risk group, and we don't see anyone. We are still very much at home. So this is the only way I could do this, actually.
And actually, this is, we're having somebody from Japan next week. So this has sort of opened, my eyes to sort of take off the shackles of having people in person and being able to bring them from all over. So there have been benefits.
Also, I now live in the Berkshires, so this is really easy. I didn't have to come to Boston to do this.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so hello, everyone. Professor Rabinovich, as you know, has titled this talk, Building the City, but it's really about land making in Boston. So I've added this subtitle. So when we look at, this is a map that was surveyed about 1770 on the right, in comparison with a 2005 aerial of Boston on the left. They're exactly the same area, but they are very different. And the difference, of course, is all the land that has been made between 1770 and 2005. When we compare these two, we can see that Boston was originally, as you know, a small peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow neck where Washington Street runs. Here is where that peninsula was originally, and this is Washington Street. Charlestown was also a peninsula, and you can see that in the original street grid up here. So was South Boston. And again, you can see the original land in the street grid. And East Boston was a series of islands out here. Now, of course, it's where the airport is. So the difference between these two is all the land that has been made by filling in the tidal flats that are surrounded these landforms. Tidal flats being areas covered with water at high tide and exposed mudflats at low tide. Some people call this process landfills or landfilling, a term I don't like for Boston because landfills means, at least to me, filling on top of existing land, and that's not the way land was made in Boston. As I just said, what was filled was water, not land. And besides, landfills sound like garbage dumps to me, and that's not what we're talking about. Other people call this process land reclamation, and I don't think that's a good term for Boston either. Land reclamation means, at least to me, diking, pumping, and draining to reclaim land from the sea, and that's not how land was made in Boston. In Boston, as you read, land was made by a really simple technique. A structure during most of the 19th century was built on the tidal flats around the outer perimeter of an area to be filled, and then fill was simply dumped in behind it until the level of fill was above the level of high tide. It was that simple. So I call this process land making, and I call the product of this process made land. Well, another way to look at all the made land in Boston, what's all this beeping? Anyway, is looking
It's
at
just the people, someone joins it being dinged.
Oh,
Don't
I see.
worry about it.
That's okay. Is this map, which shows the original land areas of Boston in the darkest green. This is in 1630 when it was founded. And then all the rest of this around it is made land. The different colors just represent different time periods in which the filling was done. Professor Rabinovich wants me to explain how all of this land was made in Boston. And that's really too much to do in an hour. But I am going to talk about filling, first of all, around the original Boston Peninsula. Then I'm going to touch on some in Charlestown, and then explain what was going on in South Boston and East Boston in more detail. So, to start with the Boston Peninsula, this is a 1795 map of Boston. This green line snaking through the map is the boundaries of Boston in 1795. So you can see that in 1795, Boston was basically just the peninsula, a little bit of today's South End, south of the Neck, and then the East Boston Islands. All the rest of these places around Boston that are now part of the city, Charlestown, Roxbury, Dorchester, South Boston, were not part of Boston in 1795. Boston had been, as you I'm sure know by now, the leading town in the British colonies until about 1740. Its population in 1740 was about 17,000, but then it really went into a period of stagnation and then decline. First, because Boston was the staging area for the British in a number of their invasions of Canada in their mid-century wars with the French. Then there was all the disruption connected with the Revolution. And then even after the Revolution was over, Boston didn't recover quickly. Its economy was based on shipping. It was a maritime economy. And Boston could no longer trade with members of the British Empire. Also, there were a number of serious depressions. But about 1790, the Boston economy began to recover very quickly. First of all, it was due to the wars between Britain and France in the 1790s. the US was neutral, so Boston could carry the goods of either country, which was very advantageous. Then 1790 was when the China trade was inaugurated, which was a very lucrative trade for the merchants who participated in it. That was basically a New England trade. So the Boston economy began to recover quickly. The town again became prosperous, and many people moved to this newly prosperous town. The population had crept up to about 18,000 by 1790, and then it almost doubled by 1810. The question was, where were all these people flooding into Boston going to live? The original peninsula had been pretty well built up by then, and Bostonians at the time never thought of moving to the mainland. In the first place, as you can see, all these mainland areas belonged to other towns. But in addition, none of them had good developed port facilities. And as I said, Boston's economy was a maritime trading economy, and it was centered here on what I call the Central Waterfront and Long Wharf. This is the same Long Wharf as today. So Bostonians' solution for their need for more land at the beginning of the 19th century was to fill in the tidal flats surrounding the peninsula and to make more land. So that's what we're going to be looking at. This is an 1800 map of Boston, and if you have trouble relating this to the city today, maybe this will help. This is the same map plotted on a 1997 aerial of Boston. So you can see that this area up here, the Mill Pond, for example, is what we call the Bullfinch Triangle today. And this is the TD Garden. This is the Beacon Hill Flat. Back Bay is out here. And this is the Central Waterfront. Here's Waterfront Park. And you have to remember, this is before the Big Dig. So here's the Central Artery going through this area. One of the very first of the land-making projects was precipitated by the fact that in 1798, Massachusetts moved its State House. The State House had been here at the head of State Street. That's the old State House that's still there, the one with the lion and the unicorn. But in 1798, they built a new State House, that's the present State House, on the south slope of Beacon Hill. This is a detail from this 1800 map showing the new State House here. Well, as you can see, the south slope of Beacon Hill at that point really wasn't developed at all. The north slope had been settled for quite a while, but not the south slope. And a group of developers realized that if the State House was going to be located here, people would want to move to this area. So their idea was that they would develop this as a residential area. Beacon Hill, as I think you know, had 3 peaks. It was called the Tri-Mountain, and that's the origin of our word Tremont. There were these 2 large peaks here connected by a ridge, and then the 3rd peak was over here. And here is where the new State House was. This is a street plan, a modern street plan of Beacon Hill, but showing where the peaks of the Tri-Mountain was. The developer's idea was that they were going to cut down this westernmost peak of Beacon Hill, and when this area was graded off, lay out new streets, and then with this dirt from cutting down this part of Beacon Hill, dump it into the Charles River down here at the foot of Beacon Hill to be able to lay out a new street. And that's exactly what they did. This is an 1814 map, and you can see by this time there's some new streets here, houses have been built, and this new street, which is Charles Street, had been laid out at the foot of Beacon Hill. You can also see it on this is a 1992 bird's eye view. Now I've drawn on the original shoreline. The peak, this westernmost peak of Beacon Hill was right here behind Lewisburg Square, right about there. So they cut that down, took the dirt down to the river, dumped it in, and then on the newly made land were able to lay out Charles Street, and they filled up to the line of River Street, right up here. This building, which was built very soon on the made land, is the African Meeting House, which is still there today. Well, they not only needed new residential areas in this fast-growing town, they needed new commercial areas. So one of the other early projects was to make new commercial facilities in the central waterfront area. And here is a detail of the 1800 map of that area. Another group of developers, or actually, they were a lot of the same people who participated in all these projects, decided that they were going to build a huge wharf down in this area here, out onto the flats. Then they were going to extend this street over the wharves and docks in this area right here, and then build a seawall and build yet another street out here to connect India Wharf, which they named India Wharf because of all this new trade with the Far East, to connect it with Long Wharf. This project took place between 1803 and 1808. It's called the India Wharf Development. And here you can see it finished on an 1814 map of Boston. And to show you where that is, well, not exactly today. This is that bird's eye view again, but unfortunately, and it's the best way I have of showing you this, but unfortunately, it's before the big dig. So what you see is the central artery, and I'm sorry, but just think Greenway in this area right here.
Good for them to be able to visualize that. When I moved to the city, that's what was there.
That was there. It was this great elevated highway that just simply cut the whole this whole area apart, cut the waterfront off from the rest of the city. So India Wharf is where Harbor Towers is today. So this is the land that was made for the India Wharf development. This land right in here. Then that wasn't enough. Some of these same developers had the idea that what they would do is annex South Boston to the peninsula and develop this as a residential area. This is that 1797 map again. So to do this, they wanted to build a bridge between the peninsula and South Boston so that people wouldn't have to go all the way around the bottom of South Bay to get there. Now, their idea was to build a bridge on the most direct line, which would have been here. Let me show you. This is an 1806 map here. But these wharf owners in the South Cove objected. They said that a bridge here would cut off their wharves. So finally, the developers were convinced to build the new bridge to South Boston down here, which, as you can see, is sort of out of the way. Here, we can see it on this 1805 map. This is where they wanted to build the bridge. This is where they actually built it. But to make it easier for people to get from the main part of the city to the bridge, they built a new street to it by building a seawall here and then filling in here. Well, you can say, but they're still cutting off the wharves. Well, the wharf owners then extended their wharves out from the other side of the seawall. So what they're making here, again, sorry, central artery, but you can see what it was like. This part is still here. This is the I-90. This is the I-90 intersection with I-93. So here we have, this is the neck. This is Washington Street. And this is the new street that was built from Beach Street down to East Berkeley Street. That's where the bridge went across to South Boston. And it's today Harrison Avenue. This is Tufts Medical Center, and it's part of Chinatown in this area here. This helps you relate to what we're talking about. So by 1807, the date of this map, we've seen they added some land at the foot of Beacon Hill for a new street. And in the process, they were developing The south slope of Beacon Hill is a residential area. They'd added India Wharf, and they'd made land on the central waterfront for the India Wharf development, for more commercial facilities, for all this burgeoning trade. And they had annexed South Boston as a new residential area, built a new bridge to it and a new street to make it easier to get to the bridge, and made this land in here. But when we compare this 1807 map with an 1813 map, you can see another big land making project that was taking place at the time, and that was the filling in of the mill pond up here. This was a really big area. This was 43 acres, and they were going to fill it in and then lay out streets on it for a residential area. The dirt for filling in the mill pond came from the middle peak of Beacon Hill, right here. It was the one behind the State House. Now, remember, this is a modern drawing of Beacon Hill. So the rear wing of the State House didn't exist at this time. In fact, the side wings didn't exist either. It was just this central part. So the middle peak of Beacon Hill was the one right behind the State House. And there's some very famous drawings of cutting down Beacon Hill behind the State House to get the dirt to fill the mill pond. Now, I know this looks like the front of the State House, but apparently they were mirror images of each other. We just don't see the rear of the State House anymore because now all of this is covered with the rear wing. Anyway, note that they're cutting it down with hand tools, with picks and shovels, and then loading the dirt into these horse-drawn tip carts. And that was a really typical way of moving dirt for land-making projects during most of the 19th century. This is an 1824 map, and you can, by this time, the mill pond was almost completely filled in, and it made the land that's now south of Causeway Street. This is what we call the Bullfinch Triangle. It actually also made some of the land in the North End today, but this part, the Bullfinch Triangle, did not develop as a residential area the way they intended to. It really became more of a commercial and light manufacturing. The author of this map, by the way, note, had put his interpretation of where the original shoreline of Boston was on this map. And although it's not completely accurate, it's fairly good, and it gives you some sense of how much land had already been added and made in Boston by 1824. In 1822, Boston adopted a city form of government. Up until that time, they'd had a town meeting, a form of government. Those of you from New England know that means it's a chance for all the residents of the town, or sometimes today, representatives of the town residents, to meet together once a year to conduct town business. But by 1822, Boston had 40,000 residents and over 7,000 voters, which was many too many to fit on the second floor of Faneuil Hall, which is where town meeting met. So after many, many years of discussing this, they decided to adopt a city form of government with a mayor, a board of aldermen, and a common council. The second mayor of the city was a man named Josiah Quincy, who thought that a fitting project for the new city would be to clean up this old market area here, which we can see on this 1814 map, and build a brand new market area for this new city. Now, the market house is Faneuil Hall. That's what it was used for. And in front of it, apparently, was a really decrepit set of wharves. A sewer drained out here. Apparently, there was an old hulk on which oysters were sold. The whole place was decaying. It was smelly. It was really not attractive. So the idea of the project, and by the way, note that these wharves are the same. Here, this triangular wharf, you can see back here, this is this wharf here and the one down here. So the idea was to build a seawall down at this end, that is down here, fill in over the docks and wharves in this area, and then erect 3 great new market buildings on the made land. This, of course, is Faneuil Hall back here. This project was carried out between 1824 and 1826, and you can see it finished on this 1826 map. Here are the 3 new market buildings, and this is a project you know about. It's the Quincy Market development. Quincy Market was the middle of the market buildings. You can see them too in this 1827 lithograph, which is the view from out here from the water. So here's Quincy Market with Faneuil Hall behind it in the North Market building and the South Market. This is the view today. So where the sailboat is obviously has all been filled in and is made land. We'll get to that. So this is this 1826 map that we've just talked about, the filling of the completion of the Quincy Market development in comparison with an 1835 map of Boston. You can see there's obviously been some land making, probably most obvious along the neck right down here. This happened in the early 1830s because the city wanted to develop this area, the south end, which they owned, as a residential area, but they thought it was hard to get there because there was only Washington Street. So in the early 1830s, they filled in the flats here and then laid out Tremont Street on the new land. And they also laid out what became Shawmut Avenue between Tremont and Washington. These flats here were filled by their private owners. This is what's now the Castle Square housing development, and this is Bay Village. Actually, what's up here, which is the public garden, was also being filled in the 1830s, but it really doesn't show very well on this map. Another development in the 1830s that affected land making was the introduction of railroads to Boston. This is a detail, from an 1833 map of the Boston area, and it shows these early railroads. So one came up from the south here, from Providence. It was called, not surprisingly, the Boston and Providence. It's where Amtrak runs today. And it chose to put its tracks entering Boston across Back Bay. Another came in from the west, from Worcester, so called the Boston and Worcester. And these are the tracks that are today next to the Turnpike. And it too chose to put its tracks across Back Bay to depot areas in South Cove. And then a railroad came in from the north, from Lowell, the Boston and Lowell. That's the railroad that runs out of North Station today. And its depots were located here on mainland above Causeway Street. So all 3 of these first early railroads had depots on mainland, most prominently the Boston and Lowell and the Boston and Worcester, and I'm going to talk about those 2. First, the Boston and Lowell. Its land was up here north of Causeway Street, as you can see. Now remember, this part had been filled as part of the Mill Pond project. So we're talking about adding this land right up here where the O'Neill Federal Building is today. The dirt for this came from cutting down the 3rd peak of Beacon Hill, which was in this area right here. Now, here is the State House right there, and this is the Center Plaza building, and this is the courthouse building and the John Adams Courthouse. And there's sort of an open space behind them called Pemberton Square. That's where the peak of the hill was. It was called Pemberton Hill. It was cut down in just 5 months in 1835, and the dirt was taken, this time by ox cart, up to this area here and filled in for the depots of the Boston and Lowell, right up here. The Boston and Worcester was their tracks were on land that was made especially for them in South Cove. Some of this was fill that was brought by the railroad itself. It was gravel from Brighton, but most of this of South Cove was filled with mud that was excavated from South Bay and was brought to this area by scows. To show you where that area is, we're talking about filling in this area right here.
That's
So,
it. What do you say they were brought by?
scows, S-C-O-W-S.
What is that?
A scow is a flat boat with not very high sides. They excavated the mud in South Bay and then brought it up here and then dumped it.
A
So,
flat boats.
well, low, you know, doesn't have very high sides so that you could excavate and dump the mud into it easily and also dig it out of it easily and dump it back on that. They did not have any power shovels doing this at this time. This was all done by hand at the time. So to show you where it was, this is the South Cove area that was filled for the Boston and Worcester tracks. So here's South Station up here. This is Neelan Street. This is what we call the Leather District. This is the Tufts Medical Center and part of Chinatown. So we're talking about filling in this area right in here. This is an 1846 map of Boston. One of the major developments in the 1840s that affected landmaking was the huge influx of Irish immigrants into Boston, starting in 1845, fleeing the potato famine in Ireland. Now, the city's response was not to welcome the Irish with open arms, but to try to keep the Yankees in the city to counter the Irish. This was a time when the Yankees were beginning to move to nearby suburbs like Roxbury Highlands. The city wanted the Yankees to stay in the city, both as voters and as taxpayers, to counter the Irish. So the city felt that they needed to develop some nice middle-class residential areas to attract the Yankees, to entice them to stay in the city. One place they wanted to develop with this area was South End, which they owned. Now, to understand what they did in the South End, you also have to understand that during most of the 19th century, sewers drained out at the sewers discharged at the nearest shoreline. From there, the sewage was supposed to be taken away by the ebb tide. Actually, a lot of it was brought back on the incoming tide and sat festering on the flats at low tide. It was really pretty awful. So to make this a nice residential area, the city decided that what they should do was extend the sewers from the South End out further into South Bay. This is still raw sewage that's being discharged out here, but further from where people were going to be living. Then they would fill in this area here and then build commercial wharves along South Bay. This was the South Bay Lands Project, which began in 1845. And by the way, just note, on this 1852 map, everything in gray is made land. So not only is the South Bay Lands Project being filled, but you can see here's the area on the other side of the neck we saw that was filled for Tremont Street, Castle Square Housing, Bay Village, Public Garden, and South Cove that was filled for the Boston and Worcester tracks. This is an 1855 map of Boston, and you can see the South Bay Lands Project actually went on for years. There was a huge scandal associated with it, but it was mostly finished by 1855. This gives you some idea of the land that was made in comparison with 1846. This, the 1855 map also shows another place that the city had its eye on to develop as a nice residential area by filling, and that was Back Bay. So I know you read the chapter on Back Bay, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Well, first of all, why was it called Back Bay? Well, I think we go back to our 1770 map and look at it. We see the Charles River coming down here past the Harvard Square area of Cambridge, and then about here at what's now Kenmore Square, opening up into this huge bay on the back side of Boston Neck. So I think that's why it was called Back Bay. Now remember, this is still tidal. The dam has not been built. This is not a freshwater basin. Between 1818 and 1821, a group of speculators built a dam across all of Back Bay, from the Common all the way over to what's now Kenmore Square. And there was a road on top of the dam. This is Beacon Street. So it went from here all the way across to here. And it was done in order to power some tide mills on what was then called Gravelly Point in this area here. Then, as we saw in the 1830s, the Boston and Worcester and the Boston and Providence put their tracks across Back Bay. And as you can see in this 1839 drawing, those tracks were really up on sizable embankments. So by 1855, there was no way the sewage could drain out of Back Bay. Sewers were discharging into this area here from all these surrounding areas, but they were cut off, first of all, by the railroad embankments and then by the mill dam itself. Back Bay had become incredibly polluted. A famous 1849 city report that you read called Back Bay a great cesspool. It said there was a greenish scum all along the edge, and the surface beyond was bubbling like a cauldron with the noxious gases escaping from the corrupting mass below. It was really disgusting. Well, everybody agreed that the solution was to fill it and to make it. And then the city had in mind that it would be a nice residential area, an upper middle class residential area that would keep the Yankees in the city. But note, the city did not do any filling of Back Bay. This is one of the big, except for, you read, this little strip here next to the public garden. This is one of the big misunderstandings about the project. This part of Back Bay was about 400 acres. About 100 acres up here were filled by the state. The part from Arlington Street to a line between Exeter and Fairfield, and between Beacon and Boylston. All the rest of this, it was about 300 acres, were filled by the Boston Water Power Company, the corporation that had been operating the mills on Gravelly Point. Now, as you saw in the book, but I'm going to show them again, there's a nice series of photographs taken from the dome of the State House that show the progression of the Back Bay project. So this is one, I put two together, as you can see, taken in 1858. So what we're doing here, we're looking down the mill dam. This is Beacon Street. This is the Common. This is the public garden. This line of trees is on what's approximately Arlington Street. And then these are the railroad tracks crossing in Back Bay. These buildings here are on Boylston Street, and way down here are the ones on along Tremont Street. And this was the Boston Water Power Company's part of Back Bay. They began their filling in 1855, but the state didn't begin until 1858. It was part of the project determined by law that Back Bay had to be filled with gravel. Now, this was a time when people still believed that diseases were caused by the bad odors from rotting animal and vegetable matter. They called them the miasmas. It was called the miasmatic theory of disease. But gravel did not have any organic matter in it, so it was considered the most desirable type of fill. The problem was that all the sources of gravel had in Boston had been pretty well used up by this time. So they went out 9 miles to Needham to dig the gravel for Back Bay. The gravel, and these are two 1858, this is a lithograph and a photo of the gravel site in Needham. The gravel was dug by what they called steam excavators. We'd call them steam shovels. And the fact that they're ladies in this lithograph, I think must mean that it was a day of VIP visit to the site. In any case, an accompanying article said that as a gravel train was pulled past the steam shovels, each car could be filled with just 2 shovelfuls. Then, once a train was loaded, it would take off for Back Bay on tracks that ran basically where today's Riverside branch of the Green Line runs. Once in Back Bay, the cars would dump sideways, and then the gravel would be leveled by horse-drawn scrapers. Now, this is an 1860 photo or a detail from one. And to compare it with our 1858, what we're looking at here is the public garden. So I think we must be looking at this area right in here. And you can see that basically this area here has already been filled in. To go on with these photos, this is about 1866, same view. So you can see by this time, by this time the filling reached up to about Clarendon Street, and the buildings that still exist on Arlington Street had been built there. And this is a continuation of the same view in 1869. In fact, this building here, I think, is the same as this one here. So this is Marlborough Street, this is the Comm Ave Mall, Newbury Street, and Boylston Street over here. And you can see the Arlington Street Church here, which would be, here's Boylston Street, it would be right about there. This is one of the very first buildings that was built on the newly made land. This is the Church of the Covenant that's now today at the corner of Berkeley and Newbury. To go on with these photos, this is the 1880s. By this time, much more filling had been done and more recognizable churches, including Trinity Church in Copley Square. And then this is the 1890s, when Back Bay was completely filled, and the Harvard or the Mass Ave Bridge had been built across the river on the line of Mass Ave. You can see the same development in maps. This is 1851, before the project began. The Boston Water Power Company had done this filling down here by 1851, but it wasn't regulated. It wasn't part of the project and didn't meet the same standards. 1861, the state had filled this much up here. The Boston Water Power Company was working on this area. By 1871, the state had filled almost all of its flats, but the Boston Water Power Company had a lot left to do. And by 1882, most of the eastern part of Back Bay was filled in. So this is an 1880 map of Boston in comparison with the 1855. So we can see Back Bay has been filled in, and also some other land making. This was this seawall had been built at on the Beacon Hill Flat and in the West End, so that these flats right here could be filled in, basically because they were so polluted. Sewers drained out here. On the central waterfront, a street, it's a little hard to, everybody's faces almost get in the way. But anyway, there's a street that goes right across the wharves and docks in this area right here. And then these docks had been filled in. That street had been built to put a railroad track on it so that it could connect to the depots that served the railroads coming in from the north, which were in the Causeway Street area, to the depots that served the railroads coming in from the south, which were in the Neelan Street area, and make it easier to ship goods through Boston. This railroad track actually existed on Atlantic Avenue and Commercial Street until 1971. And then you can also see there's been some additional filling in South Bay. This was to connect the two parts of Albany Street. One part had been laid out as part of the South Bay Lands project down here. One part had been laid out when South Cove was filled, and then they connected them by filling in this area here. And you can see these developments on this. This is the map from the Atlas, which you looked at. And by the way, I should say the Atlas is not designed just for kids. The Atlas is designed for everybody. People were
I wasn't suggesting it is for children, and in fact, the descriptions are great. Only that I use it, and my kids also like it.
It's designed for everybody who's interested in Boston history. So that could be the casual adult who's interested in Boston history. And it's also designed for serious scholars. It's got a lot of data in it. We tried to come up with something that would be useful to a lot of different groups.
Absolutely. You know, I did, I went to another professor's graduate seminar last week, zoomed in, of course. And the one, it was to talk about a bit about the challenges of public memory. It's a class on digital humanities and public memory in Boston. And the one map I showed them to show them how difficult it is the map you have based on the 2010 census on segregation. And so this was in a graduate class to sort of show them the extent of segregation in the city to show them the visualization of these challenges. So even graduate students use it.
I hope so. Anyway, so this is an 1880 map from the Atlas showing the amount of land making to that time, up till that time. Same thing as this, but here we've colored it according to the reason for the that the land was made. So purple is residential. You have the Back Bay project and also Castle Square Housing, Bay Village. This is, I should say, the Mill Pond doesn't show because this is 1828 to 1880. Here's the filling that was done for Tremont Street and for Albany Street. And, oh, they're blue, sorry. New streets are blue. And also Atlantic Avenue on the central waterfront. Transportation is orange, so for the depots, for the Boston, Lowell, Boston and Worcester areas, and red is commercial. So we've talked about some of the filling that was done now about the Boston Peninsula, but as you can see, other parts of Boston also were having land making. By this time, Charlestown had become part of Boston. It was annexed in 1873. So let's talk about what's going on there. This is an 1879 map of Charlestown, and actually it's the map on which this map is based. So red is commercial development. What's going on here is part of something that was really of great interest to Boston at in the last decades of the 19th century, and that was they were interested in port development, in developing big wharves, large wharves for ocean-going ships served by railroads. So this was a wharf that had been started in the 1850s on the north shore of Charlestown and not really completed until the 1880s and 90s. And here you can see it completed on an 1896 chart. This is called Mystic Wharf. It's a huge wharf there. It's now actually the Boston terminal for imported cars. But perhaps more dramatic is what's going on in South Boston. What is this huge wharf extending out there? Well, to understand that, we have to go back a bit. Remember, South Boston had been annexed to Boston in 1804, and a bridge had been built across it, across here. That bridge was really sufficiently out of the way that people did not come and settle in South Boston. It never developed very quickly until A more direct bridge was built here where they wanted to build it in the first place. This was in 1828. Then more people began to come to South Boston and settle. And as you can see, by 1852, which is the date of this map, this part of South Boston had been somewhat built up. Furthermore, some industries had located on the North Shore. Yellow is industries, and made some land there. And then this huge wharf had been started in the 1830s by the Boston Wharf Company. Now, the Boston Wharf Company wharf, and here you see it on an 1847 chart, the Boston Wharf Company wharf was being built out into an area on the north shore of South Boston called the South Boston Flats. And you can see them on this chart. It's this whole area here in gray. The middle of the 19th century was a time when people were really concerned about the condition of the shipping channels. What the theory at the time was what kept open the shipping channels was the force, or they called it the scour, of the ebb tide. That is, when the tide was going out, they thought that that force is sort of kept the shipping channels open. Well, there was a lot of concern about what the Boston Wharf Company wharf was doing to the scour of the ebb tide. Some people argued that it was keeping the scour from coming across the South Boston Flats and going into the Fort Point Channel, and it was preventing the scour from keeping the Fort Point Channel open. But other people argued that the Boston Wharf Company wharf was actually directing the scour, the force of the ebb tide, into the Fort Point Channel and helping to keep it open. Well, obviously they needed more information. So finally, Boston prevailed upon the federal government to make a huge study of Boston Harbor, which they did between 1860 and 1866. As early as 1863, these commissioners concluded that the Boston Wharf Company wharf, which as you can see has been extended by this time, was actually helping keep the Fort Point Channel open. It was directing the scour into the Fort Point Channel, and these commissioners recommended building a seawall around all of the South Boston Flats in order to keep open, or to help keep open, not only the Fort Point Channel, but the main shipping channel, which was out here. They originally said, we'll just build a seawall, but then they were very quickly persuaded that the area behind the seawall could be filled in. So that's what's going on here. This is the beginning of building this seawall around the South Boston Flats. The Boston Wharf Company had built most of this seawall here. The state, however, built one up here. This is Fan Pier. You can still go see that. Look at that seawall today. It's where the federal courthouse is. And then the project was taken over by the state harbor commissioners, who with great enthusiasm just kept filling these flats and extending the wharves and the seawall across them, thinking that what they were doing was building this wonderful port development that was really going to help Boston shipping. This is as much as they had filled by 1896, and this by 1916. By this time, they had also built two big wharves out here. This was called Commonwealth Pier. It's now today's World Trade Center. This is the head house they built in 1912. And Fish Pier, which also still exists, which they built in 1913 for the Boston fishing industry, which until that time had been located at T Wharf. And down at this end of the project, they were building an enormous dry dock, actually the largest dry dock in the world at that time, although a study had said it really wasn't needed in Boston. And this photo is actually, it's two that I put together in photo merge. And believe me, the ship didn't curve, but when I put them together in photo merge, it curved them. So I'm sorry. It was a large ship, and what I wanted to show you was how big that dry dock is. So sorry about the curving ship, but maybe you can get the idea. Then in the this is a 1921 chart. During World War I, the Army took over this area here and filled it in order to build this huge building on the mainland. This is where they stored war material before they shipped it off to Europe during World War I. This is now the Design Center building, and here's the dry dock, you can see. Also in 1921, notice that they're beginning, as part of the project, to connect the mainland to Castle Island and fill in this area here, which is now where Boston's container terminal is. This project went on until the 1930s. This is a 1934 chart, basically showing the end of the South Boston Flats project. It made a huge amount of made land, actually the second largest land making project in all of Boston. And then more filling has taken place since. During World War II, the Navy, which had taken over the dry dock and used this as an annex to the Navy Yard in Charlestown, built this, what they called the quadrilateral quay up here, and these 4 piers, and they filled in the end of the reserve channel here to create land on which to build barracks for sailors. The last filling on the South Boston Flats project was in the 1980s. They filled in these piers here to create what was called Subaru Pier. This was Boston's imported car terminal until it was taken over by the Big Dig. Then the imported car terminal moved to Mystic Wharf in Charlestown, as I said, and this became the place where they dumped the dirt from the Big Dig before it was taken out to Spectacle Island in the harbor. So this area that they filled with such enthusiasm lay almost deserted for 100 years. This is a 1998 photo of the area. So we're looking this way. This is, by this time, Commonwealth Pier had become the World Trade Center. Here's Fish Pier, but most of this area was parking lots. And down here, there were a few fish processing industries, and that was it. It never became the big port terminal that the harbor commissioners had envisioned. However, in the 1990s, this area finally began to be developed, and I think simply because it was the last major undeveloped commercial area in Boston, and it was very close to downtown, as you can see. So the federal courthouse opened here on Fan Pier in 1998. This hotel also opened in 1998. As you can see, this excavation is for another big building, which I think is this one. And now this whole area, as you know, is one filled with offices, hotels, restaurants. This is the Seaport District. Actually, I don't like calling it the Seaport District because it never was a seaport. I like calling it the South Boston Waterfront District, but no one else does. So I finally have given in. But in any case, so finally, 100 years, almost 100 years after this land was made with such enthusiasm, it is now a very vibrant part of Boston. Well, to go back to our 1880 map, so what's going on in East Boston? Well, the East Boston Islands, as I said, had always belonged to Boston, but they were owned by the major island, which was Noddle's Island, was owned by one family. And it did not develop until that family decided to develop it in the 1830s. They formed something called the East Boston Company, and their idea was that they would develop this as a residential area with commercial and industrial areas along the waterfront. And that's exactly what happened. By 1880, this was a residential area, and it had various commercial, various port and industrial areas along the waterfront. This is East Boston in 1896, about the same thing. However, this huge area of flats extending out from East Boston in this area were eyed by all these people who were interested at the time in port developments. So they made this proposal in 1915 to develop the East Boston flats. The idea was to fill in two huge arms. Now here's Governor's Island here and Governor's Island here. So they were going to fill in all of this area here, a huge arm, extend wharves from it, and then fill in another huge arm here. Here's Apple Island there and there. So they're going to fill in all of this for another huge arm with this big open area between the two, right in there, for a port development. This began in 1915, and you can see in 1916 that they're starting to do the filling here for this arm. By 1921, they have filled this much and built the bulkheads for, let's just go back and review, because this configuration becomes important. So you can see they're going to fill this arm right here, leaving, and this becomes very distinctive, this L-shaped configuration to create the central basin. But in 1921, this project took a very unexpected turn. Boston was looking for a landing field, as they called it, an airport. They wanted to participate in this newly growing airmail service. They considered many different sites, including, one was Carson Beach in South Boston, and one was that area that was being filled between the mainland and Castle Island, the one that's now the container terminal. However, after considering many sites, they finally decided that the airport would be temporarily located on this area in the East Boston Flats that was being filled for a port development. They said one of its advantages was that it could be expanded. Little did they know. Well, in any case, the airport was only supposed to be a temporary occupant of this made land. So the airport opened in 1923. As you can see, a little more filling has been done in this area here. The original runway was this T-shaped thing. And you can see we're looking at this area right here, where these bulkheads have been built. Now, by this time, they'd given up building stone seawalls. Stone seawalls were expensive and they were difficult to build. And they had begun building wood bulkheads on the flats to hold the fill. They weren't nearly as substantial, but they were a lot easier and less expensive to build. So the airport opened in 1923, and then they continued filling of this area, thinking they were doing this port development in the 1920s and 30s. This is 1934. You can see this, they still think they're creating the central basin for the port development. This is an aerial from 1930. By this time, they've paved this much for the runways, but they're still keeping to the configuration of the port development. And this is as much as they had filled by 1937. They didn't give up the idea that this was going to revert to a port development until 1939. Then, during World War II, with this great expansion of aviation, they filled in all of these flats for extended runways. Now, I think the 1947 aerial is a little hard to see. It's probably a little easier to see on this 1952 aerial, how much filling they did of these flats. And then the filling has continued. This is the 1969 aerial, which in comparison with the 1952, they're filling in this area right here so they can extend this runway. So what's being filled is right there, obliterating Wood Island Park, which was a beloved recreational area in East Boston. They're also beginning to fill out over the Bird Island Flats, this area right here. And here is the airport today. And this map, which also comes from the Atlas, I think you looked at it, shows all these different stages of fill in the airport. So the lightest yellow is what existed in 1923 when it opened, 1937. Then this huge amount that was done between 1943 and 1946. And then some of the filling since then. The orange is the Bird Island Flats, this part for the extension of the runway and obliterating Wood Island Park, etc. So that should give you now some idea of how, of how all of this land was made. Now, we've talked about some of the Boston Peninsula, Charlestown, the Mystic Wharfs, the South Boston Flats project in South Boston, and the airport in East Boston. Before we end, though, I wanted to talk about this green area along the river in Boston. This is the Esplanade and Storrow Drive, and I thought you'd be interested in that story. This is a map of this area of the Charles River Basin in 1894. And this is a photo of Back Bay taken from the Harvard Bridge in 1894. And this is a photo I took 100 years later from the same place. And actually, it's the same buildings. Oh, this is behind the people. Well, down here you can see this building with the white trim is this building, and this building with the Oriole window is this one. So in other words, as you can see, the seawall that you see next to Storrow Drive existed there in 1894. It was actually built, as you read about, in the 1860s during the Back Bay project, but Storrow Drive is all on made land. So that's what we're going to talk about. Well, back to 1894. So the problem was, well, first of all, as I said, the Charles River was still tidal at this point. This is high tide. This is obviously low tide. The problem was that after years of sewers discharging onto these flats, remember the sewage is supposed to be taken away by the ebb tide. Actually, a lot is brought back by the incoming tide and sits festering on the flats at low tide. They were disgusting, disgusting looking, disgusting smelling. And by this time, the germ theory of disease had been introduced and accepted. And so people knew that all this sewage festering there was a source of disease. So the question is what to do about it. Well, in this case, what they decided to do was to build a dam down here to turn this whole basin from a saltwater tidal basin into a freshwater basin that would maintain the water level always at the same height, keeping these flats always covered with water. They weren't taking away the sewage, they were just covering it so that you didn't see it or smell it. I call this the out of sight, out of smell approach to pollution problems. In any case, the dam was built. You can see it here on this 1916 chart between 1905 and 1910. This is where the Museum of Science is today. As part of the project, they filled in a narrow park along the Back Bay side of the river. And here we are looking, we're standing about here in 1919, looking upriver at the Harvard or MIT Bridge. You can see this narrow park that was filled in. And note, by the way, this is the dome of MIT on the other side of the river. MIT had just moved to this area in 1916 from Back Bay. This is looking at this newly made land from the other direction, from the Mass Ave Bridge, looking downriver. You can see the narrow park. This is Back Bay here. And this is a 1923 aerial that shows this same narrow park along the river. Well, there was a problem. This was meant to have created a water park. That's what they talked about. However, they found that waves, the wind coming across the basin, kicked up waves that then bounced off the seawall, and they created such a chop it was dangerous for small boats and especially for rowing shows. So also this park was so narrow, it really didn't have any recreational amenities. So after years of discussing it, they decided in 1932 that they were going to double the width of this park, add some recreational facilities, the lagoon that still is there today between Exeter and Fairfield, and what I call the Make Way for Ducklings Islands down here. And then they were going to slope the shore down to the river instead of ending it with a seawall. Those improvements took place in the early 1930s, and you can see here in comparison with the 1923 aerial, this is the 1934, you can see the doubled width, the new lagoon, the Make Way for Ducklings Islands. And this is looking upriver, the same, here's the original park right here. This is what was added in the 1930s. Back Street, by the way, is still there. This is where the seawall runs. And Back Street it's like an alley that runs behind the buildings that face Beacon Street here. Well, this project had been accomplished by leaving out an important part. There was supposed to have been a highway all along the river on this part, the part that was filled in the first decade of the 20th century. However, it had been omitted because Mrs. James J. Storrow objected to it. She had given $1 million towards these improvements, towards the widening, and she didn't want a highway here, so they left it out. But after, so here we are in the 1930s. After World War II, they felt they had to add this highway to deal with Boston's traffic mess. This is Storrow Drive, called ironically Storrow Drive, even though Mrs. Storrow objected, because the part that was added in the 30s was named the Storrow Memorial Embankment in honor of her gift. So everybody always says, poor Mrs. Storrow. Anyway, so the drive was on the part that was filled, that first part that was filled in the first decade of the 20th century. Then to compensate for the land taken, they were going to add new islands out here next to the lagoon. Actually, they didn't add all of them. Here's the lagoon that was done in the 30s. They added these islands down here, but they did extend the filling up behind the Bay State Road area. You can probably, this is 1934, and you can see the difference. This is where the new islands are, and probably, again, in this comparison. So that, I just thought you'd be interested in how the Esplanade and Storrow Drive came into being. So that is as much as I really have time for. What we've seen is, I hope, has given you some idea of how of where all of this made land came from. But to review, we will go back quickly. These maps come from the Atlas. This is by 1828. So we talked about the filling done, remember blue is new streets, at the foot of Beacon Hill for Charles Street, next to the made Harrison Avenue today along the neck. We talked about the building of the India Wharf development, the Central Waterfront, and also the Quincy Market development here. And then the filling in of the Mill Pond, which was intended as residential land, although it really didn't develop that way. Then by 1880, we saw in the 1830s, we saw the filling along the neck for Tremont Street, the Bay Castle Square Housing, Bay Village areas, and the public garden, and the filling done for the railroads. Remember, they're orange, for the Boston and Lowell up here north of Causeway Street, and the filling of South Cove for the Boston and Worcester. In the 1840s, the beginning of the South Bay Lands Project in the South End. And then in the 1850s, the beginning of the huge Back Bay Project. And then finally, filling in on the Beacon Hill Flat and in the West End to cover these polluted flats. We saw about the building of Atlantic Avenue across the central waterfront for that railroad track, and the filling in of Albany Street for in the South End to connect the two parts of Albany Street. Then in Charlestown, just to go on, the filling for Mystic Wharf, the huge South Boston Flats project, and then the biggest project of all, the airport in East Boston. Now, these colors are from that map. I sort of superimposed it here, so they are not the right colors to show you different reasons for filling. Anyway, I hope that through all of this, I've given you some idea of how we got from there to here. And now I know this has taken a long time. I'd be
it's
glad
perfect.
to answer questions with any time that's left.
Yes, absolutely. There is time left for questions. It was really absolutely perfect, and I learned a ton, and I know the students did as well. So before I open it up to questions to you, Dr. Seasholes, and I have some of my own, and there's some in the chat, but I want to ask the students a quick question. So what body of water would the Weston have sat on? Where you are right now, what body of water would it have been? Anybody? I hope I get this right myself, but yeah.
Oh, that's pretty easy.
Come on, folks. Somebody jump in.
Well, we're on like the river where if like the Back Bay wasn't filled in, we would be like on the river where like the Esplanade like was made.
I don't think that's right.
Isn't the
What's not
Weston
Back
behind
Bay?
Copley Square?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that right, Dr. Seasholes?
No,
I don't think so. No. The Pacific.
sorry. No, just think about it.
So yeah, so nope, it's a different body of water. You can look at the maps. Anybody? It is whoever wrote the Atlantic. It is the Atlantic, but I mean, what body of water within the Atlantic? Come on, somebody.
So I go back to a map that shows
Yeah.
this?
Let's go back. Let's see it.
Okay, here. So Copley Square is, well, Copley Square is in here. So what are we
Oh,
talking?
so I'm wrong then. I was going to be wrong then. Then whoever said the back bay was correct.
Yes, isn't
Yes,
that where
yes,
the Weston
Back bay
is?
was correct. Yeah.
Okay, what did you think it was?
I was thinking, looking at the map, it would be South Bay, but I'm
Oh,
missing-
no.
Yeah,
South
yeah.
Bay's over here.
Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah,
Back Bay.
Yeah. Very good. So you're smarter than your professor. Who was it that said that? Who said Back
Me.
Bay? Jake? Yeah, you get kudos. All right, excellent. No, that was really, really wonderful. So I want to ask one question from earlier, from a student who asked whether there was carryover of this this sort of what he calls ecological industriousness from England to the colonies, right? Was this something that was done a lot in England that the colonists took up in New England? Or was this
You mean the idea of land making?
Yeah. And techniques also, yeah, who was asking.
No, I wouldn't say so. In fact, I had a hard time figuring out where they got the idea that they could fill so much land. at the beginning of the 19th century. And I finally decided it came from wharf building techniques. And it seemed to be that way in the 18th century too. I didn't talk about the earlier projects, but we found an area, especially along the mill pond, where some land had been, consciously they had made land, and they had done it by using a wharf building technique, which at that time they built wharves like a log cabin. We call them crib wharves. So they would build up and that's how this had been done. So at the beginning of the 19th century, they began to build wharves the way India Wharf was built, which was they built a seawall around, sorry, the outer perimeter of the wharf. Then they filled in the interior, drove pilings into that, and then put the wharf buildings on those pilings. And I think that's how they got this idea that they could make land. Some places, I mean, the mill pond was really big, and that was an early project. But it was already dammed off with the mill dam. It wasn't that deep. So they didn't have to build a lot of new structures. And by the time they began filling in areas, remember, they're not filling deep water, they're filling tidal flats. But some of them had wave action by the time, like the South Boston Flats. They spent a lot of time talking about how to support those seawalls and how to, you know, keep them from washing away in wave action. But by the time they got to that point, which was later, they knew better how to do it. So in any case, that's what I was able to figure out. I spent a lot of time looking for literature, thinking that they would talk about where they got the idea, but
this is a particularly American thing. And is it a particularly Boston thing within the United States?
no, they were doing this all over. I mean, every major city every major city everywhere on a coast, on a major river, on a large lake has made land on its waterfront. It just seemed to be something that people thought where they could easily make land. So I wouldn't say it's an American thing, but it certainly was developed here.
So I have a really excellent question from Toby, who asks, how did the construction itself affect the economy of Boston, in the sense not just the let's say opening it up for shipping, et cetera, but did the construction itself become a primary industry of Boston? The building of, was making land itself one of the key industries?
I wouldn't say so. But interestingly, the workers and the people who moved the dirt were almost invariably Irish. Even,
so it was
even as early as the mill pond. I mean, there were Irish, you know, there were Irish in Boston before the potato famine.
Yeah.
And it was, I did go back and do a lot of documentation. The people who dug the mud in South Cove in the 1830s and 40s, they were all Irish. I mean, it was very interesting.
And I mean, I would have to imagine that one of the incentives to keep the land making going, right, to keep filling more or making more and more land, was not only the need for the land, but of course the need, you know, the employment that it provided, the money that went to the firms doing it. Was that not part of what was driving it?
No, they were, as far as I could see, at least what they talked about was the money they were going to make from selling the land that was made. They honestly, I don't.
Corruption. I mean, there was no sort of kickbacks or.
Oh, there was tremendous scandal, as I said, over the South Bay Lands Project. I won't even, but it's a wonderful story. Yeah. But no, most of the discussion was how much this land was going to sell for at auction. This was particularly in Back Bay, since the state owned it. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about that, but they did not seem, at least in the records I read, and I read through all the Boston Water Power Company papers too, they were not concerned particularly about the workers they were paying, just about the money they were going to get for the land.
Counterintuitive to me, just in terms of the money that could be made, as an incentive, the money that could be made in the industry itself. But very interesting. I have a bit of an icky question, because you kept talking about the problems with sewage and sewage coming back with the tides in the 19th century, and that this is being something, in terms of pollution, that they really needed to deal with. So how did sewage work in the 19th century? I mean, what were these underground tunnels that,
Boston had an extremely elaborate system of underground drains that went all the way back to the 17th century, but they were not allowed to be connected to the privies until 1834. Then they were. So those basically functioned as sewers, and then the city built sewers to drain the sewage out to the nearest shoreline, as I said, and that was their theory. They didn't put in a sewage system until the early 1880s. And then, well, you'll have to read. It's a wonderful story. But basically, they built what they called perimeter sewers around the city. They intercepting sewers, excuse me. They intercepted the sewers before they discharged on the flat, took the sewage, they built these intercepting sewers. They took the sewage out to what was then called the calf pasture, that's Columbia Point. They pumped it up 35 feet in that pumping station that's still there at UMass. It went through an outfall sewer, down a tunnel, 160 feet under the harbor, over to Squantum, and then on a causeway over to Moon Island, where still raw, still untreated, it was released into the harbor at the ebb tide. Same thing did for the northern system. It was released, well, we don't have a map that shows it here. Oh, no, it doesn't. We don't have maps that show it. So
that's super
Deer
interesting.
Island, and then the south one was from Nut Island. Anyway, all this raw sewage was released into the harbor from the south one until 1952, from most of it till 1968. This is why we needed a Boston Harbor cleanup.
Well, thank you so much. It was really wonderful. We learned so much. And before you leave, I have to ask the trivia. This is a hard one. I told you I was going to make it hard. All right, so listen up, and I'll put it on canvas in case you missed it. But the question is, 2 of the first 8 houses built on a newly widened mill dam in 1852 are still standing. So what street are they on, and at what cross street? Those 2 houses that were 2 of the 8 houses first built on Mill Dam are still there. And what's the corner that they're on, or the closest cross street? Well, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. The coffee out of this is so delicious, by the way. So you definitely want to win this one. Seasholes,
Can't wait.
yours.
Haven't had my coffee this morning.
Well, you'll be soon be drinking out of yours. Mine, I'll be sending it your way. And thank you really so much. I have to let the students go, but it was really wonderful. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all. It was fun.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.